The shot for cervix cancer. Well, how much time do we have? All right. I'll do a little bit on HPV. I'm not going to go through every one that I have, but I'll go through a few of them. As you know, there are these, cute little ads that are shown to teenage girls that, you're hip and you're cool and you're doing the right thing if not only are you having sex, but you're getting the vaccine to prevent you from getting cancer for having sex. And girls are promised, in USA, iPhone, raffle tickets and things like that if they get their vaccine. So these are just some of the ads that are being used. Some of them are much worse than this. The biggest problem with calling HPV vaccine an anti-cancer vaccine is that they haven't studied it long enough to say it's an anti-cancer vaccine, but that most of these infections will resolve spontaneously within 1 to 2 years, and that these are slow-growing cancers. They're caught, the vast majority are caught doing just cervical pap smears. In addition to that, there are ways to reverse this, what we call atypia or dysplasia that can be associated with the HPV. And I'll talk about that in a minute. This slide is basically just showing you that 99.85% of humans who are exposed to the 16 and 18 serotype, the supposedly high-risk viruses that are associated with cancer after multiple prolonged infections will actually never develop cervical cancer. Okay, so this is actually from an official World Health Organization sponsored by GlaxoSmithKline. You can see up at the top, so can't really argue with that. HPV isn't just sexually transmitted. Some babies are born with it. Some babies pass it to their parents. Some parents pass it to their babies. There are lots of other animals that have it. It's found on skin and throat and from tonsils in children. So about 11% of people have some form of this without having had any sexual contact at all. And so to think that we can give this vaccine to 9 to 12-year-olds because they're virgins and that it will be helpful is not necessarily rational, especially given that there's scientific evidence that if you already have these strains of HPV and then you get vaccinated, that your risk is higher for abnormal cell development. So this is a good one for you to know about. In 2008, Gonzalez Bosque, I probably butchered that name, published an interesting paper where they actually looked at the cervix of women who had developed this carcinoma in situ, which is what you're worried about because it can turn into invasive cancer. This is non-invasive cancer. And they looked to see what strains of HPV were in these particular abnormal cells. And they found that, that there were other types that were not 16 or 18. They found that some of them had no detectable HPV at all, but more importantly, that only 28.2% of women who had this abnormal cervix development confirmed by actual biopsy, so this is not philosophy anymore, this is actual biopsy biology, were exclusively infected by 16 or 18. And they said that this places doubt about the degree of protection afforded by this vaccine. So different countries, different populations tend to have different strains that are more prevalent there. But 16 and 18, there's two other ones that are in this vaccine that are not associated with so much the cervical cancer, but 16 and 18 are the ones that are supposed to be preventing cervical cancer, and they're not present in they're only present in 28.2% of these biopsies that they did. I'm going to skip that one. I already talked about this, that if HPV is already in the body, we know that 11% of the population is already exposed regardless of sexual activity, and this is a conservative estimate. And this paper, Gardassil Clinical Review, June 8, 2006, showed that Gardasil vaccinated people who had these pre-existing infections had an increased risk of precancerous lesions of 44.6%. There's other study that shows with Cervarix, which is the vaccine I think you're using here, and that's around 30%. I actually have these papers that say this. Okay, so if we compare in the developed world the prevention rate between Pap smears and the theoretical prevention rate from the vaccine, what we see is that Pap smears are a much more efficient and useful tool to prevent cervical cancer. This Pap smear data is actual data because it's, say it louder. Okay, thank you. Is that this is actual data because Pap smears have been done for like 60 years or something like that, so we actually know the incidence rate in societies that are getting Pap smears. So it's around 8 per 100,000 women. And remember, this is a slow-growing cancer that the vast majority are able to be treated and their lives saved. For the vaccine alone, this is a theoretical number that 14 out of 100,000 would be the rate of cancer for Gardasil and 9.5 for Cervarix. So you can see that compared to both of these, Pap smears are still a better bet. And you're not being injected with caterpillar, DNA, and aluminium. So speaking of caterpillars, I had to take a couple pictures for you. This is the insect cabbage looper that is used to propagate the virus. As I told you before, you have to grow virus on a cell in order to be able to harvest the pieces of the virus. They also use one of the adjuvants in there is called ASO4, monophosphoryl lipid A. This comes from a salmonella bacteria, from the outer coat of the salmonella bacteria. And it also contains polysorbate 80, which some have theorized this to be a potential infertility agent. One of the problems with vaccination studies, the big problem, is that they don't use real placebos. Okay, so for instance, it's very rare to see an influenza vaccine trial where they used a saltwater injection as the placebo, which is what should be the placebo. What they do instead for influenza vaccines is they either use the previous year's vaccine or they use hepatitis A vaccine. And when you ask why, they say because we don't want to deprive half of the study participants of something that could benefit them. I kid you not, that is the official answer. So it's not different when it comes to cervical cancer vaccine studies because they have been using placebo, which is called carrier solution. So as you can imagine, the adverse event rate will be altered by using a substance that will have an effect, especially a substance that can have a negative effect. And this is just showing you that placebo includes aluminium and saline. They did both. The background substance, let me see what this is. Okay, this is the product formulation. This one I believe is for Gardasil. So it has the 4 different HPV proteins, it has 225 micrograms of aluminium, L-histidine, an amino acid, the solvent, detergent polysorbate 80, sodium borate. So this would also be considered as a carrier solution. And I looked each of these up and they're not inert. I mean, the sodium chloride, you can say, might be depending upon the concentration, but The concentration of sodium chloride can make it either compatible with the body or not compatible with the body.